Good evening. Good evening. I think we're going to start now. Good. Shall we start? Very good. Welcome to you all. Welcome to Darwin, Biology, and the Brain's Order and Disorders. This is the second of 6 discussions, debates on the brain and the mind. And the idea of this series is a forum where neuroscientists will meet artists, philosophers, and analysts. The series is sponsored by the Wellcome Trust, and if you want to find out more about it, and in particular about the next four evenings in the series, you can go to www. and then all one word, thebrainandthemind.co.uk. Tonight we have 3 speakers, Anthony David, Peter Hobson, and A.S. Byatt, and I'll start by asking them just to say who they are.
I'm Tony David. I'm Professor of Cognitive Neuropsychiatry here at King's College, and I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work at the Maudsley Hospital.
I'm Peter Hobson. My interest is in human development, and particularly the ways in which early social experience is foundational for much of much that's special about human development in the intellectual sphere as well as the social. And in addition to being a research scientist, I'm a psychoanalyst.
I am A.S. Byatt. I'm a writer, and I'm in a state of panic because I think I've lost my handbag in the loo, which was going to cause me to be distracted. I am here on this panel because I think that constructing complicated and lengthy fictions is a form of disorder of the brain.
Thank you very much. Do we really have a handbag problem? Yeah. Very good.
Apologies. You can see I'm disordered.
And I'm David Papineau. I'm a philosopher. I work here at King's College London. I work on the philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of biology, that kind of thing. Let me start by just saying a bit about what we'll be discussing tonight, or what we might be discussing tonight, because I'm not sure what the other speakers are going to say. One question I hope we'll cover is what's the difference? What's the definition of the difference between mental disorder and mental health? How do we define the disordered mind as opposed to the healthy mind? Now, one approach is a Darwinian one. One could think of this in terms of some kind of biological malfunction, some way in which the mind or part of it is failing to operate in the way it's been designed to operate by evolution through natural selection. And this way of thinking about disease as opposed to health isn't just restricted to the mental realm. People try and define disease versus health in this way for all kinds of diseases, and the approach has its own problems. It's not obvious that every case of biological dysfunction, a bit of short-sightedness is a disease, and it's not clear that every disease is really a case of biological malfunction. And you might think for this reason that the biological approach is completely the wrong place to start. Many other people think that one should think of so-called mental disorder in a quite different way, in terms of the relation of the individual, the so-called disordered individual, to the wider society, the wider culture. And from this perspective, a kind of Satzian or even Langian perspective, the problem with the disordered mind is just that it doesn't fit in. It's awkward from the point of view of the wider social context. It's something that needs to be fixed because it troubles not so much the individual but the surrounding society. Now, interestingly, these two ways of thinking about the nature of mental disorder aren't as opposed as you might think, aren't necessarily as opposed as you might think. Some of you might have read one of the suggested background readings for this session was Darwin in the Madhouse by Stephen Stitch and Dominic Murphy. And one thing that they point out is that one way in which the mind or part of it can fail to fill its biological function, to fail to operate as designed, is if the modern environment is very different from the environment of our evolutionary history, the environment to which the mind is adapted. I mean, you can see how this might work. You could see how some psychological traits, characteristics that work very nicely in an extended, larger family of hunter-gatherers might well cause trouble in a society where people grow up in very tight and enclosed nuclear families. You might take the view, and this is what Stitch and Murphy suggest, that depression is a healthy, temporary response to a perceived setback. I mean, somebody's outcompeted you, you should hunker down for a while. And then they suggest, but if you're in a society where images of the rich and famous are going to be flashed at you non-stop, it's all too easy to become depressed in the longer term. So, if you think about those two approaches to to mental disorder, I think one moral is that we shouldn't necessarily think of the Darwinian biological approach and the cultural approach as opposed. There are ways in which they can complement each other. So that was how to define mental disorder. I think a second issue we'll discuss, and perhaps the two psychiatrists on my right will focus on this, will be to do not so much with the definition of mental disorder, but the causes of it. It'll be a matter of what kinds of developmental trajectories lead to a healthy mind, an ordered mind, a normal mind, and what leads to a disordered mind. And in particular, I'm sure we'll be interested in the question of how far certain genes and certain kinds of environments are involved in the production, the development of the healthy mind, and how far disordered minds can be seen as due to abnormal genes or abnormal environments. Now, of course, there's a great deal of research into this, and I imagine we'll touch on some of it. I mean, there's a long tradition of heritability studies that try and ascertain how much of the variation in mental attributes, including variation down to the level of disorder, how much of that variation is due to variation in environments, and how much is due to variation in genes. And in the last few decades, we've developed a lot of resources that will allow us to look more closely at the mechanisms involved in development. I'm thinking here of mapping of the human genome, all the information we get from functional imaging, and that will allow us to focus in more closely on the way that genes or environment or both play a role in the development of the normal mind, the disordered mind. Let me finish by making a further comment about Darwin. Darwin's in the title. I'm not sure how much he's going to appear from now on, so I thought I'd better give him a bit of a run for his money. You might think that when we're thinking about the causes of various mental attributes, the development of order disorder, Darwin would be relevant only when we are thinking about genetic causes. So there's genes in Darwin, and then there's environment, and it's something else. But I think that's very much the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, any Darwinian, Darwin himself, Richard Dawkins, any Darwinian is going to recognize that environments are as important for development as genes. I mean, the point is obvious enough. People can be malnourished and Their development can be damaged in various ways, even though there's nothing wrong with their genes. Their environment is wrong. In fact, and I think this is something that Peter will take up, genes and environment can be intertwined in much more intricate ways in development than that. It doesn't have to be just a matter of here's your genes, here's your environment, and kind of together they sum up to the end result. Think about, I'm sure many of you have observed animals, cats, lions, domestic cats, birds, teaching their young to hunt or to forage or to get food in various other ways. And if you watch that, it's very difficult to doubt that the inclination to teach the children is a deep-seated part of the animal's biology. So there's part of their biological nature, the parents, creating an environment which the children will learn from. And on the other side, it's a deep-seated part of the offspring's biology to learn from the environment that's being created by the parents. And if that applies to cats and birds, it's going to apply all the more so to deeply social, deeply educated beings like us. And I think when it comes to humans, it's just a mistake to think of development as somehow being produced by two independent causes. The genes and environment will be entangled in all kinds of complicated ways in the development of any interesting mental characteristic. So I certainly think we should be interested in genes and interested in environments because they are different things. But I think it's a bad mistake to think that biology and Darwin is entirely to do with the genes and that the cultural and environmental influence is something else. I think Darwin and biology is involved in the whole caboodle. So now it's time for our other speakers to continue, and first of all, it will be Anthony David. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we covered so much ground there, it's hard to know which bit of that complex tapestry to focus in on. And any one of your clauses could be expanded into several symposia, I'm sure.
Don't tell me.
So I shouldn't complain about that. But let me just, if I can just say a little bit about my interests and try and pick up on some of those themes. And I think possibly the easiest way for me to do that is to sort of go through my biography, if I may, not because it's interesting in itself, but it would just help me structure my thinking in the area. So I trained in medicine before coming into psychiatry. So a psychiatrist is a medically trained practitioner. So that gets rid of one of the first issues of what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. And apart from that, and about £20,000 a year, there aren't any real differences. So I trained in Glasgow University, and I think because of that, I became aware of R.D. Laing and his writings. We weren't by any means contemporaries, but that was something that was in the air even when I was training. And so here was a person who was taking head-on the idea of mental illness as being a sham and a creation and an artifact. But actually what I took from R.D. Laing was I got interested in schizophrenia. And that I took through my medical training. I then did neurology for a few years and became very immersed and interested in the brain and disorders of the brain. But decided that psychiatry was what I wanted to do, and I came down to the Maudsley to train, and my eyes were opened by the amazing range and depth of interests and teachers there, including Peter Hobson on my right. And so I trained in clinical psychiatry. I became interested, again, I think because of that early exposure to schizophrenia and psychosis, the most severe forms of mental illness. Mental illness characterized by hallucinations, by delusions, by disturbances in the nature of thought. The sort of conditions, although they come firmly under the psychiatric banner, there's a very strong intuition amongst most practitioners, lay people who come across such patients, families, that there's something wrong with the person's brain. Now that doesn't mean that it's impossible to relate to the person as a human being, to understand their anguish, their thoughts, their feelings, their aspirations, but there seems to be something very, very wrong that one is driven to try and sort of putting right. So here's a psychiatric condition in many ways the sort of epitome of the psychiatric disorder that ought to have a neurological basis. In fact, most of the research that goes on in my institution is about trying to uncover that biological basis. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that there is a disorder in the brain, however characterized, but it never reaches the point where you would call it a neurological disorder. It's not like having Parkinson's disease or a stroke or Alzheimer's disease. It's of a different order. So although we learn from doing neurology how subtle abnormalities of the brain will affect behavior, perception, memory, language, we know that we know from that, from witnessing that the brain and the mind are obviously intrinsically linked. And yet we talk about this disorder without any firm, hard and fast evidence of a disorder of the brain. It's our assumption, but we haven't actually pinned it down. And that, of course, makes it so fascinating. My particular interest in schizophrenia and psychosis, and in fact across the whole spectrum of psychiatric conditions, is the extent to which the person, the individual, accepts the idea that they are suffering from an illness or a disorder. And you said in your introductory remarks about how we define a disease. Do we define it in terms of pure biology? Do we define it in terms of a social dysfunction? Or do we try and find some theoretical underpinning, a Darwinian approach? So that would have to be some sort of biological disadvantage. Does that work? But the individual's experience is rather different from that. Does the person understand that their experiences are not shared by other people? That what they believe is happening to them seems real, seems true, and yet other people don't seem to see it like that and insist that it's something wrong with them. And we call that insight. And the extent to which a person has or can develop insight is incredibly interesting. So there's a psychological process involved of viewing oneself as if from the gaze of another person, but taking account, even in a very implicit way, that there's disorder and there's order, and recognizing that, where one sits. And that is, I think, in itself a very interesting process. We can look at what happens in the brain when a person is trying to accomplish that task. We can look at how that relates to their progress through the healthcare system. And we can look at how actual coarse brain damage can affect the possession of insight. So that in itself is I think, of great interest and might help us understand some of these other things. So my current clinical work is in neuropsychiatry, and I've got some colleagues here. Mike Copeman There's very distinguished neuropsychiatrists in the audience. And what we see are people who do have neurological disorders of the brain. So that's clear, but the manifestation where it's causing them and others difficulty is the psychiatric consequences, the psychiatric and behavioral consequences. So again, that there's no escaping the link between the brain and the mind and behavior. But what we also see are people who appear as though they have a disorder of their neurological system, and yet, to the best of medical science, they don't. So in fact, whereas people with schizophrenia are convinced that there's nothing wrong with them, whereas everyone else thinks they're ill, these people are convinced there is something wrong with them, whereas everyone else is telling them, no, there's nothing wrong. But of course, they're telling them there's a different kind of something being wrong than they understand. So, again, those sorts of clinical problems constantly demanding of us an understanding of what is a disease, what is a disorder, what is the brain and the mind, what are things that people acquire through their experience, and what are things that they've brought with them through their development. And that's why, for me, being a clinical psychiatrist and a researcher, half and half, more or less, makes it for a very useful interface.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. And now, Peter, will you follow in?
Okay. Well, I'll pick up the tradition that Tony's established and just say a bit about my background. I too am trained as a physician and then a psychiatrist, was indeed at the Maudsley. But in between, at Cambridge, did an integrated degree in experimental psychology with a particular interest in developmental psychology, much inspired by Piaget. And during my psychiatric training, I then got into psychoanalytic training in parallel. And much of my career has been kind of split in two, between being essentially an experimental psychologist, working most particularly with children with autism and other fields too, and alongside that as an analyst and then within the National Health Service as an adult psychotherapist. But what unites all this is an interest in developmental psychopathology. And developmental psychopathology is a mouthful to say, but actually it's a very simple idea, which is that if you're going to understand typical development, you would do well to measure that against the story of atypically developing individuals, and conversely, to understand atypical conditions, think of autism for instance, you would do well to measure the developmental story against that of typical development. And that the two together might enable you to arrive at understandings of human development that you wouldn't have if you took each story in isolation. Now, the other thing that kind of brings together my different interests is what I referred to earlier as my interest in social development, social engagement between people, the way in which we may need to take very seriously what happens between people from early in development if we're going to understand the development of the individual. And this is where autism entered kind of my life. I was at the Maudsley looking for a research project, and it was suggested to me by Michael Rutter, in fact, that I might go down to a school in the south of Kent and think about children with autism, because I've had an interest in social cognition and role-taking. And I remember this vividly. I went into this school and was immediately deeply struck by how children with autism seem to be in a different kind of world. What Wittgenstein would call, they seem to have a different form of life. In some fundamental ways, although we could make some kinds of contact, in other respects, they seemed to be operating very differently. And I was also struck by the philosophical dimension of this. I'd had this kind of hobby in Cambridge, in philosophy of mind. I went to see Bernard Williams there, and he was very helpful. But what it meant for individuals who had certain difficulties in relating to others, what this would mean for their developing understanding of the nature of people, brackets, with minds. And that led me to examine autism. And one thing I must clarify, just as Tony clarified the difference in psychologists and psychiatrists, is that although I am an analyst, my approach to autism is not, and emphatically not, that autism is caused by bad parenting. That is not my view. And it's very difficult to free oneself. When anybody hears that I'm a psychoanalyst, they can read my writings and read into my writings things that are certainly not there, nor are they intended to be there. What becomes more complicated is that I do actually look at autism in a way which is a little bit off the way most people look at autism, and it relates to some of our issues about the brain and the mind and how these develop. I do believe that in nearly all, I'll come to the exceptions in a moment, nearly all cases of children who come to develop the syndrome of autism, there are biologically based abnormalities. I do believe that. But actually, I believe there are a variety of abnormalities. And here we need to distinguish between two notions of cause in mental disorder. One is etiology, which is the medical type cause. So it could be a genetic cause, it could be damage of the fetus, it could be a variety of medical type causes which lead to the disorder, and if those causes weren't there, the disorder wouldn't develop. But there's a second kind of cause, which is connected but different, which is pathogenesis, which is that from whatever state one begins with, there's then a story, if it's a disorder of early onset in life, a story of how there are repercussions, both in terms of knock-on effects in terms of brain development, but also knock-on effects in terms of psychological development that then feed back on the brain. And one of the points I'm going to make now, because otherwise I might forget to make it in the course of this evening, is that many people say, look, it's the individual who is disordered, even the individual brain, and what we're looking for is the brain disorder that are going to characterize, for instance, all individuals with autism. Well, that may or may not be justified. My view is a bit different. My view is that yes, there is something that unifies individuals who present with a syndrome. I better say what it is. Autism is a syndrome. Now, a syndrome is a constellation of clinical features that tend to go together. Constellation of clinical features. And in the case of autism, these are a profound form of social impairment with not just relationship difficulties, but communication difficulties, and what seems to be a restriction on creative, imaginative activity. And what's important, but I can't go into, is actually the detail of each of these difficulties. The quality of the impairment in interpersonal engagement, the particular forms of communicative, including language, impairment, and the restriction in imaginative life. And the question is, why do these things go together? And of course, there are those who want to make the links through an account of neurology. Well, I don't. I think that the links are actually going to be links that you need to understand through saying, okay, the human being, in the typical case, has certain capacities to begin with. They build on each other in a story and development. And out of this story comes our higher cognitive functions, our intellectual abilities, our imaginative creativity, as well as our complicated social relations. But in the case of children with autism, when Leo Kanner, American psychiatrist, first described the syndrome in 11 cases, beautiful paper of 1943, he said these children have come into the world with innate inability to form the usual biologically provided affective contact with other people. This was not a popular scientific theory. One of the reasons was we don't have measuring instruments, or at least it was thought we don't have measuring instruments for affective contact. And so we have language theories of autism, cognitive theories of autism, computational theories of autism. But it seemed to me that affective contact between one person and another is a fact of human life, and actually a rather important factor of human life. And if you haven't got it, then some remarkable things might follow. I shouldn't really have said haven't got it, because I don't believe it's all or nothing. I think children with autism have certain kinds of contact, but they have a tenuousness, a fragility in terms of their engagement with others, which really makes a difference to the way in which they can develop their intellectual as well as social capacities. So that's what I and colleagues have attempted to study, mainly through experimental psychology, in the children with autism. And alongside this was this psychoanalytic work, where I see what traditionally would have been called neurotic patients with more everyday kinds of difficulty, serious sometimes, yes, but nevertheless familiar to us all, anxiety, depression, so-called personality disorder, and so on. And the two were going in parallel. Until one day, my colleague Tony Lee and I what we tend to do is to try to think up tasks that are kind of a bit different, and we were mucking about. And we've done a series of studies on emotional expression. This had a philosophical grounding as well, because we were really not happy with what was then, and to some extent still is, a current notion of children developing a theory of mind. The idea that I have a theory that you have a mind, and I have some computational, largely inferential process working out that. You have a body like me, and you have these expressions, and maybe you have a mind like I do, that kind of account. I've condensed it. Seems to be totally the wrong way round, and much more persuaded by the notion that you find yourself engaged with embodied people, the Strawson idea that persons are the primary thing. You watch babies engaging, it doesn't look like they're doing much theorizing, but by golly they engage, and that out of our experience of persons we distill in development, for which we need a story, a notion of bodies on the one hand and minds on the other. But actually minds are embodied in persons. So we've done this work on recognizing emotional attitudes in other people, and children with autism do have some difficulties. But we thought, look, we've got a bit stuck on this. We thought, how else can we get into what is special about human contact in a slightly different way? And we had a preoccupation, because in our developmental story, and I'm going to very briefly map it out, it's this. Babies, typically developing infants and others, get a grip on each other. They're affected by other people, they're interested in other people, and towards the end of the first year of life, they are moved by other people, not only in their own states, but in relation to a shared world. So the paradigmatic example is of social referencing. Here's an object. Tony's my dad. I'm a 12-month-old, or slightly younger, and I'm interested in this object, but I'm not sure about it. And I look to Tony, and if Tony looks at me and then looks at the object and smiles, I'm likely to go forward and explore. If Tony shows a disgust or a fearful reaction, I will back off. Now this is what I think, 2-3 minutes, that's fine, a pre-inferential, affectively grounded mode of relating to Tony's relation to the world, such that the world comes to fall under a different description for me. It moves from being mildly interesting to being an object, a source of fear. It has become a frightening object. And I think this happens actually in a different way than me just finding out that it's frightening. That is, that I register, even as a 12-month-old, that it is through another, that this object, that I have learned about this object. And the vital importance of this, which gets elaborated over the succeeding 6 to 9 months into the second year, is that the world is becoming not just a world for me, but a world in which I can take alternative stances through other people, and constantly we do this, you're doing this as you listen to me, on a shared world. Now, if you're debarred in large part, not completely, from that kind of experience, then it affects not only your social life, obviously enough, but also this experience of a shared, multiply referenced world that you're constantly engaged with in alternative ways, even within your own mind, as well as through other people. So, in my 2 minutes, I'm going to tell you about this experiment. The experiment was,
1 minute.
watch this, right? So you're my participant. We have a participant, and this, you've got to pretend this is a, which one shall I do? I'll do the pipe rack and stick one. So this is a pipe rack. I used to smoke a pipe. As you might remember, occasionally I slipped it into the moors. Not allowed to these days, but I've given it up. And he had a stick. And all he said was, watch this, and either I stroke this stick gracefully along this little bit, rat-a-tat-tat, or if you were another participant, I did like this, harshly. 5 minutes later, we gave the participant, this is our children with autism, saying, use this. And what happened, I'll cut a long story short, was that all the children were interested. They all, bar I think one, did indeed pick up the object and strum it along the pipe rack. So they all saw the goal of the other, and they were interested, motivated to repeat it. The difference that we predicted was that being the case, if you videotape what went on, gave it to judges who didn't know which the children had seen, they could tell, for the children without autism, whether the children, when imitating, were either harsh or graceful. That is, they imitated the typically developing children, matched in appropriate ways, imitated the person's style of strumming the stick. The children with autism did everything else, but they did not copy the style. You couldn't tell whether it was harsh or gentle. All they did was to strum the stick along with serrations. But something else, which has happened simply by chance, which is that when I did this and gave it to the children, those children without autism put it to their shoulder. They'd seen me putting it on mine, but they automatically put it on theirs. They identified with me and moved to their position and put it against their shoulder. The children with autism left it on the table and did this. Since then, we've done a host of studies which we can come back to on the notion of identifying with somebody else. And I think this is a natural propensity of human beings, which has itself a developmental history, but is deeply important in this being moved through others. And the children with autism haven't got that same grip, and there are a host of clinical as well as experimental set of data to illustrate how this being moved through others is something that they are relatively out of. And I think it has profound implications. The final thing I'm going to say is the link, bridging these two, is identification is a psychoanalytic concept. And the notion is that actually in development, we are constantly identifying with other people, and the very building up of our own emotional worlds is heavily influenced by alternative stances within the mind. And that's of clinical importance that we may or may not come back to.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So now over to you, Antonia. So we have some slides, do we?
Could I have some more water as well?
Of course.
I'm going to start with a story while the slides are going up. I am only related at a very curious tangent to the very precise discussion that's gone on before. I'm going to talk about the inside of my own head, and you can work out whether this is disturbed or normal. In a book of literary criticism, I read a story of a boy who was peculiarly gifted and always won at chess. And his friends said to him, "Tell us how you do it. How do you always win at chess?" And he thought for a long time, and then he said, I imagine the board, and I imagine all the possible moves with long coloured tails coming from them, moving around on the board, and I pick out the strongest pattern. And the only times I lose are when I pick out the more beautiful pattern and mislay the strong one. The story goes on to say that this boy then fell over with his face on the chessboard and could never do it again. I have lately become very interested in my own mental processes when constructing a novel. And I think it's having slightly the same effect on me as it had on the boy. I do now have slides. This is a Golgi-stained neuron. One of the things that first excited me was when I came across, I think it was in Jean-Pierre Changeux's books on neuroscience, the earliest pictures of these multiply linked, directed neurons in the head. I thought, there at last is an image of what it is actually like in my head and in my body. I know that, I thought. Can you do the next one? This is another image of what it's like in my head. It's Matisse's Red Studio, which contains a great many works of art by Matisse. And he painted it on a green ground, and he painted it, I think, on a blue ground. And finally, he got it together on a red ground. And the red, as it were, is the inside of my brain, holding together all the objects I have tried to put in it. And they are held together by the colour. Final one. This is, you almost can't see the colours, or I can't from here. This is a painting by Patrick Heron, an abstract painting, and he said his paintings were entirely abstract, and they're to do with the balance of the colours. If you put the orange colour next to the dark purple, it will look different from if it's next to the pale blue. Somebody said to him, it's not totally abstract, you live in St. Ives and you constantly do, as it were, abstractions of harbours and inlets, and he agreed that this was the case. When I first agreed to do this paper, Lisa Pignanesi said, well, start by saying how you make up characters, when I said I'm not a neuroscientist. And I showed you these images because how I make up characters isn't much to do with what you might think it is. I don't look at my friends and neighbours and say, I could put you in a book. Indeed, a lot of my books are full of the horror of people who have been put in books. I just wait till I get 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 examples of the same, as it were, motion of the mind. And then I build a new character which grows out of an abstraction into a concrete thing. I take intense pleasure in this. That's A. B is that when you start writing a novel, all these people are made out of language. And if you become very conscious of the way in which inside your brain language is relating everything to everything, you find you're doing a kind of flipping mental motion from the language to the things the language is talking about, to the language to the things the language is talking about. And this can make you feel quite mad. Though, again, overexcited and also very happy. It is always this question of you need at least 2 or 3 originals, and the pleasure is in the coming together of 2 or more things that belong together, that sort of cinch. That's what I'm going to say about that. I now want to talk very briefly about a quartet of novels I wrote, which are called The Virgin in the Garden, Still Life, Babel Tower, and A Whistling Woman. These have a very large cast of people. They begin in the 1960s because I thought them up in the 1960s. And one of the ways in which they do connect to what has been being talked about is the presence of R.D. Laing. Because when I started these novels, I was only in my 20s. And Lang's divided self had appeared in the world, and I thought this is an amazing description of how a soul can be lost. And at that time I believed him about how a soul could be saved by telling the story of being lost. So one of the characters I invented was a young man called Marcus, who fitted a lot onto your descriptions of autism. I needed a character who had no language, who really was no good at language at all, All the other people could competently form relationships and talk to each other. Well, not all, there were some other mad people, but the basic characters could talk to each other more or less in more or less the same language. He was extremely gifted at mathematics and couldn't really communicate with anybody else in any other way. And I've seen examples of autistic children with this extremes. I didn't know about autism in those days, but I invented this young man called Marcus who heads into the most terrible breakdown, and because he doesn't react to things, doesn't react quickly enough to his sister being electrocuted, and stands there while she dies. I wrote the early novels in the 60s and a bit in the 70s, and then I stopped for a long time, and the last two came out more near to 2000, by which time nobody believed Lang, I don't think. People were saying, we now know that things like schizophrenia do have a biological structure. And I retreated like crazy from Lang, partly because I didn't like his later writings. I thought he misused the thing I loved most, which was language. He played meaningless games with it. And I tried to see the meaning, and I thought there wasn't one. So Marcus ends up doing mathematics and computers. That's point 2. Point 3 is that the first book was meant to be a novel, like a novel by George Eliot, with layers and layers of imagery and language all welded together. Still Life was meant to be a book without metaphor, because I was obsessed with whether metaphor was a form of treachery or danger, as some philosophers believe. So I was going to write a book about birth, copulation, and death, as T.S. Eliot put it, with no metaphors, and I could not do it. My mind, this caused me to go right backwards and think the nature of language possibly is metaphor. The third book was called Babel Tower, and it was about the languages that were springing about in the early 70s and the late 60s when I was writing. New languages like sociology, jargons, artificial languages like trying to get divorced and having to speak in a law court in very restricted terminology. People were appearing on the trial of Lady Chatterley's lover, and they weren't allowed to use any literary critical terms. And all this sort of playing with language amused me no end. The fourth book, A Whistling Woman, this is part of the feminist track of the novel, if you like. My grandmother used to look at me and when I tried to whistle and say, a whistling woman and a crowing hen is neither good for God nor men. And it sounds vaguely Darwinian. You jolly well stick to your function that you're meant to have and you don't whistle. And my heroine, or one of my heroines, Frederica, comes out at the end whistling in a manner in the world. But in this novel, there is a new university with a vice-chancellor who is a grammarian called Wine Noble. And he wants to make a real university in which everybody talks to everybody about everything in all languages, which I suppose is what this evening is partly meant to be. And he forms a conference called the Body and Mind Conference, in which people from all disciplines give papers on the relations of body and mind. And I, being me, wrote quite a lot of the papers. I had a hero who was a population geneticist, and I wrote his paper on the redundancy of the male in Darwin's structure. It would be much better if we only had parthenogenesis. I wrote two people I was very interested in at the time were Konrad Lorenz and Noam Chomsky, and indeed Steven Pinker. And they gave to my characters, who were called Eichenbaum, who, like Lorenz, had written in fascist Germany and was a theorist of the herd, and Chodopinski, who combined Pinker and Chomsky and gave a paper which I'm going to read a tiny paragraph off to finish off with. They hated each other, and I was very pleased with how I put their papers that they gave together, because Darwin's cousin Galton wrote a paper on the nature of the herd, and the sort of Darwinian nature of the herd, and how the animals that stood on the edge of a herd were Darwinianly stronger and more useful because they were keeping the lookout and the others were all just standing in the middle. And my Eichenbaum wrote a paper which I wrote chunks of in German. I didn't put it in the book in German. It was called Herde und Helder, and it was about German heroics and the nature of herds. Hodopinski wrote a paper about the problem that was bothering me, whether Chomsky was right about whether the brain actually contains language which is innate. My own feeling of the sort of terrors of my own mental spaces is that it does. Most people, I think, now argue that Chomsky's arguments are not so valid. But I have this feeling in my own peculiar brain, which is full of coloured images, that language was always there to be drawn on and picked up and constructed into complicated forms. I will read you a paragraph from Pinsky. It's a paper about metaphor and the growth of the brain. He began with a compliment to the Vice-Chancellor, who, he said, had tried to map the growth of the branching forms of language, whose seeds or germs were, he was himself convinced, already in the developing human brain in possibility before birth. And the branching diagrams of the hypothetical grammar resembled the Golgi stains of dendrites and synapses for reasons both, so to speak, matter of fact, matter of physics and chemistry, and matter of metaphor. The word dendrite derives from the Greek word for a tree. The name was an analogy. Human beings could not think without such metaphors and analogies. The action potential for an electrical jump of comparison must be born within the branchings of the grammatical forms in the embryonic brain to which he had just alluded. But what he intended to do today was make opaque and visible and problematic these facile and often beautiful metaphors with which human beings tried to think about thinking. He himself was convinced that brain, nervous system, and mind were the same thing. There is, said Hodopinski, no ghost in the machine, no external and invisible soul, no spirit come from heaven, hell, or the pit of the stomach that is not in and of that convoluted, layered slab of white and grey matter and its branches and pulses. There was a time when psychoanalysts, Sigmund Freud himself, had been neurologists, had looked for things like the repeating compulsion in the closed-circuit firing of neurons. But now the human sciences had backed away from neurology. This was at least partly because they disliked the metaphors. It was very hard to make a philosophy of mind that was not simply a criticism of particular language. He himself was interested in a science of mind that dealt with things that were only approximately objects of language at all, which brings me back to the inside of my own brain. It is essentially an instrument for language. I know I've got a novel right when I suddenly get a visual pattern like a Patrick Heron painting, and the purple bit is over here and the white bit is over there, and there is a long green line going up there, and I know what it is in my novel, but I don't know it in words. I just know the shape is right. And you can now say I'm mad. But it is that's the most pleasurable moment of writing any novel, when you get the visual form. And 2 weeks ago, I got the visual form of the novel I am writing from something Octavio Paz says about surrealism, that they turned the substance into a shadow and the shadow into a substance. And I suddenly saw two squares next to each other like an open book, and one was the most beautiful lilac, and one was the most vivid yellow. And I thought, my book is there in my head now. I know it's there in my head. I would like to end by saying that the conference at the new university is unfortunately destroyed by the disciples of R.D. Laing, who have formed an anti-university alongside a religious cult, and they come marching along chanting horrible poetry, which I also wrote myself, and burn things down and set up effigies and break beautiful glass cases containing jewels. End of my not entirely relevant contribution.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you to the other two speakers. Very good. We now have time for questions, so I throw it open to the floor. Lisa.
I would really love Tony and Peter to tell us whether they think what kind of madness it is that was Riley madness and Paladin madness that you think you have, they think. But that's so not the first answer, but I want to ask something important first, which is in The Whistling Woman, you have this extraordinary character who starts his life in a mental facility. And he behaves in his own mind in a way which I think Tony might recognize, which is that he says, he feels he sees blood everywhere around him. Everything is red with blood. But he thinks that if he doesn't tell people that he sees this blood all around him, he will pass the doctor's certification process and he will be allowed to go out and be free. And this particular interesting deviousness and self-oppression. He's lying both to himself and wants the others to accept what he says about himself to be true. I wonder whether this is something you recognize in your patients, and whether it would be possible for that particular kind of infection to happen within a kind of autistic spectrum character or not. I don't think it could, but I'm just putting it forward. So, first, why did you create this character?
I was interested at the time in religious cults, which was a development of my interest in Lang. And I mean, the terrible thing about this character is that he is a good man whose father killed his mother and his sister and was thus, in those days, hanged. So he had very strong social causes for being mad. But in the end, he sort of took on the mantle of being the person that caused the deaths and founded the cult on the Yorkshire moors into which people went on Langian journeys. And the journeys get more and more mad, and he himself does go on a journey underground to meet the mothers, Goethe's mothers and the gods underground. It was difficult to write, but as I speak, I see that also is part of my own brain somewhere, because they're all part of me, and I let the readers look into some of the people's minds as they work and not into others. I mean, he's one of the ones whose mind you do go into. And in terms of what I've just been saying, where was my mind when doing his Visions of Blood? Mm-hmm. And one of the things I have to say is the one is always enjoying it, however awful. I don't think George Eliot did. She cried like crazy when she killed Maggie Tulliver, but because I can always switch to enjoying the language. Anyway, that's a partial answer.
Well, I mean, of course, as you would agree, when you're talking about madness, you're using a metaphor, I think. And it's a very powerful one. And why is it that, great novelists are drawn to such states of disorder, such extremes of behavior? I suppose because it's a very useful metaphor to talking about what happens to people in the face of extreme circumstances, or when they're trying to resolve irreconcilable forces, for example, their past and their future, or other choices that confront them finding a place in society. And it is an incredibly compelling way of illustrating those ideas. And I think of course, psychiatrists and psychoanalysts are probably motivated by the same compulsion, if you will, to try and understand the disorder, to make sense of it. And notwithstanding that is a constant motivating drive, I think what's, in fact, to come right back to something that David said at the beginning, perhaps what makes mental illness, especially psychosis and schizophrenia, an illness, a disorder, is precisely because that search for some sort of meaning breaks down. And of course, Jasper's made that a sort of defining characteristic of it. So, that to some people is why accepting a biological explanation for disorder is so unsatisfying and seems cheap and seems to lack an explanatory power. And yet, that doesn't mean it's not true. And in fact, it probably is true. It's probably precisely because we can never, there comes a time when we can't really understand these states of mind in a meaningful, causal way that makes it madness. But our drive to do so, our compulsion to do so, means that we inevitably learn so much more, not only about ourselves, but as Peter was explaining, to contrast the disordered and the non-disordered makes you learn so much more about both sides. And that, of course, I think is the great legacy we have to novelists and artists.
Peter, do you want to chip in? Next question. There. Just in the fourth row.
Not to worry, I'll try and project. Thank you for some very interesting contributions to the discussion. I wanted to ask...
Sorry, we can't hear a word.
That's all.
Hello? Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for a very interesting contribution. My question is really, if we accept, perhaps not a Darwinian definition, but if biology is a system that involves the embodied brain, mind, as a body within a system that's ecological, are we perhaps getting a bit too hung up on these terms of disorder and order? Because surely biological systems are dynamic, chaotic systems that come into order at different times, have different trajectories depending on how things interact. And whether we are an artist or a scientist, again, I think we get hung up on those definitions. Surely it's just interaction in the world, and perhaps it's the way that we are interpreting those interactions that is leading us down these alleys of disillusionment, both within perhaps the medical profession and also questioning our artistic or creative ability.
It's a question for the two psychiatrists, I think. I mean, could I add something to the question? I mean, there is the basic fact, whatever we think about biology and dysfunction and so on, that some conditions are distressing. In the first instance, they're distressing for the people who have them, and for that reason they need to be fixed if they can. And often they're distressing for other people, and sometimes it's a psychiatric issue to fix the distress for the surrounding people, the family. But I want to know what the psychiatrists would think about that.
Well, I think Tony's point about making sense is of fundamental importance in a number of respects. And, one of the things that Freud was suggesting is that the domain over which our ways of understanding, our normal everyday ways of understanding, might kind of apply are broader than we think, providing we take a certain shift in stance. So, for instance, beautifully in the first few pages of Morning of Melancholia, which I think is a real classic, he says, and he was talking about essentially psychotic depression, and he basically exhorts the reader to listen carefully and patiently to what the patient is saying. And if you don't understand, don't blame the patient, blame yourself and say, look, this patient must be right in some way, but at the moment we don't understand the way in which he's right, and that's what we've got to pursue. Now, I don't think you can take that all the way. I agree with Tony, there actually comes a point where you're stretching things so far that it doesn't seem to work quite right. And this seems important in terms of people with autism. I think one ought to beware anybody who makes a statement of the form, children with autism don't do X, because it's far, far too crude. Having said that, there is an issue about the appropriate stance in relation to here's a group of individuals with whom the normal common sense, in fact, many people describe individuals, the more able individuals with autism, as somehow lacking common sense. And that's not meant to be pejorative. It's meant to actually help us to try to understand what must life be like for somebody who doesn't participate, as the rest of us assume all the time, in a common form of life, in all kinds of understandings that we take to be agreed, that we structure our experience, and in certain important, and I think clinically important, humanly important ways, individuals with autism feel themselves at sea. They don't get it. And actually there's some rather fine quotations of individuals saying, for instance, one that comes to mind is a very able, articulate adolescent with autism saying, the quote goes something like, I didn't understand there were persons till I was 12 years old. Now I know there are persons, but not like you do. I have to keep reminding myself there are persons. Reminding. Now that, it is both funny and tragic, because they're in a world where so much, I think it must be hell for many of these individuals, where so much that we construct on this basis of a shared form of life isn't available in the same kind of way. Not completely absent, but fragile. So the point about making sense, and psychoanalysts have got themselves into deep trouble with children with autism, applying their normal ways of looking at how people tick to the case of autism. Though in fact the best analysts, and quite a number of them incidentally, actually said, hold it a minute, maybe the normal rules of engagement with the phenomena we're looking at are different in these individuals. And that's the point I really want to make about the biology and the social experience and what develops on. Because I think the psychoanalysts are making empirical claims, claims about contingent realities. Namely, the mind is structured in a particular way, and it could have been otherwise. And I think we have a biological basis for what I've been saying, this propensity to identify with others. I think that being the case, one ought, as a psychoanalyst as well as anybody else, to be able to imagine the case where that structuring of social experience on a biological basis is missing or fragile, and then to follow that through, what are the implications for development? And that also relates to the evolutionary story, is that I think what we have here is the possibility that we can see how the social relations of non-human primates, which has much richness and diversity in it, differs from human psychology precisely in this depth of interpersonal, inter-organismic engagement and the being moved. So that, for instance, I talked about social referencing, non-human primates socially referenced, they will look at other members of their species, scan what they're looking at to find out about the world. So if I'm looking for food, as a chimpanzee, I'm going to look at other chimpanzees. What they don't do, and what children with autism very much less than typically developing children, is to come from the environment to the other, to show things. The typical 12-month-old forever bringing things to show. In fact, Mike Tomasello has done some very nice experiments which illustrate how a 12-month-old will also inform somebody who's looking for something, and the person, the adult, comes in and doesn't know where to look. This little 12-month-old will be pointing out for the other. And that's the kind of thing that chimpanzees don't do. Mm-hmm. And whilst I'm not making an immediate leap to children with autism, but from a separate set of kind of observations, children with autism will also instruct, but the showing, the sharing, the engaging with the world through the other is what seems to be fragile.
Thank you, that's helpful. Next question. Go on.
I have another question. It was kind of inspired by an insight when she spoke of a character who she didn't know at that time was based on being autistic, the one who doesn't really respond much but eventually has some kind of breakdown. So I was wondering how true that is for real autism, like by not reacting and relating to certain people for most of their life, do they kind of reach a level of some kind of mental or nervous or emotional breakdown at a later part of their life in reality?
Well, I'll only answer this one briefly. I mean, the first thing is, it isn't just an absence. So, for instance, we did the studies. If you ask parents of children with autism, does your child show jealousy? There's good evidence from reports of parents and also some other evidence that yes, these children with autism, everyone tells you they don't make relationships. It simply isn't so. All kinds of things that go on. If you test these children, you know that they are self-conscious in some sense. So what they have got and what they haven't got, what they're relatively deeply experienced and what they is much thinner, is a complicated story which we could talk some more about. Now, in the world they have, to respond to your question, the question was, do they develop, if I understood it, other kinds of psychiatric disorder? Many of these individuals become very anxious, and no wonder, and indeed get distressed and sometimes depressed. And then there are other problems that you can have. So yes, there's an unfolding story about how they're affected by the world in which they live, experientially.
I have a question for Antonio, if I may. It goes back to the story you started your talk with about the chess player who couldn't do it anymore once he thought about what he was doing. And I was curious about how that applied to writers in general. Sportsmen and women, if they start thinking about what they're doing, they get the yips and they can't do it anymore. And I wonder how it is with writers, especially writers who analyse writing, who teach writing. I mean, is there not a danger of thinking too much about what you're doing can paralyse you? Is that what happens in writer's block?
I think it can be one of the causes of writer's block. I don't know any other way than thinking too much about what I'm doing. What I do is think so much too much that what I love is watching tennis. And I like to get to the point where I know where to put the ball because the thing is working inside without me having to, as it were, apply secondary thought systems to it.
Good.
There's a primary thought system that constructs the object I'm constructing, which is a heap of words and a class of people and a set of thoughts. There's a secondary process that says, are you doing this the right way? Is that bit too long?
Right.
And if you get to a speed where you don't have to, you can do that bit automatically. You're all right, I think. But I watch tennis players an enormous amount for that reason, to see what is deliberate, what is
of course, they have to think about what they're doing in one sense. They have to think about, should I be playing so-and-so's backhand or not?
Yes.
But they must not think about how am I moving my arm. And
that's right. They have to think about, I think they're thinking with their body. About going to so-and-so's backhand. They've had long conversations with Ivan Lendl about it's best to go to his backhand. But when they go to the backhand, they just go to the backhand. And I think there's something, even in language, I mean, I'm sure a painter, again, can do it without thinking in language. But what interests me is that I do feel I have this area of experience, this area of things happening, where I'm not thinking about, in language about how I'm thinking. The language is more like paint.
Very good. Up at the back there. I think that's working. Just speak up.
organisation, the question, because we are so diverse and so thought-provoking tonight. So we've heard about children's capacity to take other people's perspectives. We've heard about clinicians' drive and sometimes inability to do so with certain patients. And we've had this breathtaking and inspiring account of your own thought process and your assumed mechanisms as you enable the language and you create your own character. So I hear a lot about how we take people's perspectives, how we become other people, how we embody them, and how language may be important. So you all make me think about the other minds and the other brains of our current society, who are not necessarily structured by the same kind of language. And I'm thinking of artificial intelligence. I'm thinking of the very, very, very omnipotent and omnipresent digital world that we all live in. It's made digital, it's a different kind of language. And the psychiatrists and neurologists will know that we did the mistake back in the 60s of thinking that the mind and the brain, or the analysts, the unconscious, are like this kind of language, this artificial language. And at the same time, still for decades, we try to be our computers and we interact with them, and then they come back and change our minds and brains. As I said, it's disorganized, but it's a question that's been asked a lot in the past 10 years. So how is it going to be related with our artificial robots? Are we going to have the same developmental abilities? Is it changing how our artists create the character? And is it language? Does it have the same structure? Are we changing our own brains by interactions with human organisms?
Who wants to go? That's very, very interesting. Why don't I start? So one respect in which the computer model of the mind has turned out not to be good is that the human mind, its operations, involves very dense interactions with the environment, not just the social environment, other people, but with physical objects too. And computers don't do that; they just sit there. But I suppose computers are getting more interactive. In particular, they're getting better at interacting with us. Those are user-friendly computers. So one question I have for Peter: how do autistic children get on with computers, especially computers that are designed to behave a bit like people? Does it become harder for the autistic children the more user-friendly the computers become? Is that? So yeah, that was an empirical question. Maybe there's no data. Just tell me there's no data.
Let me just go back to that question first of all. Just one element in what you say, which is about are we changing? Because one of the points I really want to make before the evening finishes is about brains and experience. There's such a tendency to look at the individual with his or her brain, and there's been a tendency, which hopefully is changing, is to look at that on the model of adult neuropsychological function, where you get a bit of the brain is knocked out by something, and you get relatively specific, sometimes more broad, dysfunction. If you look in developmental perspective, you have to revise that in the sense that probably plasticity is the rule rather than the exception from early in life, and that the brain is being shaped by a child's experience as well as, of course, the child's experience being shaped by the structure of the brain. That's really important, especially over issues of localization. Wide open how much localized function as children grow older and into adults is a result of development, and how much this notion of modules, that are these bits of the Swiss knife that are there at the beginning, yielding the experience that they do. What I want to make a plea for is keep that question open, because not all neuroscientists do. They tend to, in virtue of their own professional, it's an occupational hazard, look at the brain as being the underlying cause of it. So a malfunctioning bit of brain in grown-ups causes the dysfunction. But in developmental disorders, it could equally well be that a lack of social experiences of certain kinds, or indeed other kinds of experience, actually so alter the development of the brain that you don't get the localization of function. And certainly there's a correlation between the two, but what comes first and what comes later is an open question. Coming to robots, there are indeed individuals, there's a research team, for instance, in Hertfordshire, working on intervention with children with autism with robots. I don't know that they seem keen on it. Other people seem keen on teaching children by computer with autism, social, sensitivity to social cues by computer. I have to say that is not the way I think we're going to go. I think that there's a very, to me, impressive, I've changed my view over the last 10 to 15 years about the degree of potential in quite a number of individuals who present with the syndrome of autism. There's an intervention called relationship development intervention, slowing things down, watching very closely for those moments when a child is available and structuring interactions such that you build on something that's really quite fragile in the social world with a human being, not a computer or a robot, and finding that actually something more is possible in terms of promoting development than I would have known. So in terms of that, in terms of the whole robot-human thing, clearly I actually believe that amongst other things, if the robots have got an affective life, and if they can connect, I think the actual geometry is important. You've got to connect with another embodied person with whom you can identify in relation to a shared world. If robots get to that stage, then we're away.
They've got a long way to go, though. Antonio, do you want to say anything on this one?
Well, just that the bit I read to you about language, over the page, my character, Mr. Pinsky, talks about using computers as metaphors for the brain and how dangerous this is. I remember reading a wonderful book about perception by a scholar called Ulrich Neisser, which was the first place I read the idea that perhaps we should just talk about the wet stuff and not, there's a list here in this paragraph. There were also uses and objections to uses of metaphors from systems of human communication. Words like program, code, information, transcription, encryption, message, translation were not invented to describe either the operation of the neurons of the brain or the physical mechanisms of computing machines. They derive from factual descriptions of writing and speaking, from human language talking about itself. He goes on, there's another page of metaphors you have to be careful with, because once you start using them to think with, language is doing something to you, which of course it always is.
In the front here.
I was quite struck by the description of autism which was given, and the idea that autism comes from an inability to identify, or perhaps for some to transpose their subjectivity like that of another. And that makes me think that that ability is something quite fundamental to authorship and creative writing. So that kind of leads me to wonder if anyone very autistic has ever written a novel, and if not, what would a novel by a very autistic person be like?
They do extra. There's that boy who can draw every building in complete detail.
Stephen Wilshire.
Stephen Wilshire, thank you. There are autistic artists who make quite extraordinarily complex images of the world outside that I don't know of an autistic. There are some sort of writers on the edge of surrealism, which is what I'm working on at the moment, who I think are almost autistic, or perhaps even the surrealists were almost trying to be autistic. They tried to float their minds away from themselves and let them just do their own thing and not relate to people.
But that's kind of actually inverting autism itself. Autism is the inability to identify, to then identify with someone who can't identify.
It's the blue thing becoming yellow and the yellow thing becoming blue. I don't know, do you know?
I would have thought that anybody with any degree of autism couldn't do it because of the perspective taking that you need to do in a novel, and that's what, according to Peter, won't be there.
This is true. There are the subtleties matter, though. It isn't all or nothing. It is an oversimplification, and I might be guilty of it tonight, saying they don't. It isn't quite like that. but there's a fragility about it. Now, actually, there are highly able and interestingly linguistically able individuals with autism who have written at some length. And something is going on, there's a lot of mystery about it. We don't understand, it doesn't kind of fit. And yet there are also important specialness about the way they write. And all I would want to do is to highlight how certain qualities of the role-taking, indeed, that Antonia's, and the qualities of imagination that Antonia's been describing. I would be looking for those in the people with autism, and indeed, one might find new mysteries to explain. But actually, there is often a certain kind of egocentrism, a certain kind of restriction of movement of certain kinds. We did some studies with play, where the children seemed to play, but their creativity, their fun, their enjoyment in the play was clearly different from the other children. And the question comes whether actually that's simply something that's added on to imagination or intrinsic to and essential to truly creative writing of the kind that Antonia's been describing.
Thank you. I'm afraid we've used up our time now, but there's one thing I should say at this point, which is that we have a drinks reception for everybody across the hall. But before that, could we first thank our speakers? Thank you very much indeed.